Of the 4 stages of translating classical Buddhist canonical texts, the first is to draft the translation. The second is to review the translation. The third stage is editing and proofreading. And the final stage is the seal of approval on the translation. With this series on translating Buddhist texts from Chinese to English, we're using the Sutra 佛说庄严菩提心经, either the Buddha Speaks the Sutra on Adorned Commitment to Enlightenment, or the Buddha Speaks on Adorned Commitment to Enlightenment Sutra. I haven't decided which title to use yet, but that usually comes last. And we've done the video on preparation steps for even beginning a translation of Buddha's sacred text. And then after that, we did the translation draft video and its general steps to drafting a translation. So this video is about the second stage, reviewing the translation. For the review stage, I would say there are 4 general steps. First is to read over your work for the second, third, or more times. However, immediately after you finish translating may not be the most helpful time. Give it a day to a week, and after more meditation, before you reread your draft translation, you will have changes you will want to make. The second step in the review stage is to get different people to help you review your draft translation. The more eyes to review your draft translation, the better. Get different people with different talents or expertise to review the piece for content accuracy against the original, to review terminology or a linguistic aspect, to review for basic understanding if the person were new to Buddhism, for instance, and of course to review for grammar, syntax, etc., which can also come later during the editing and proofreading stage. If you're translating the text from start to finish on your own, you can still have different people read your work and provide their opinions. You will also want to personally assume different roles in reviewing your translation. For example, a week after my initial translation, I will review it for terminology. Another week later, I will review for accuracy against the original. And another week later, something else. It will be more time-consuming for you to personally review the various aspects of your translation, but you can always be working on another translation at a different stage during this text's pause and revisit period. Removing yourself from your writing for a while, only to return as if you were reading your draft for the first time, offers the repeat readings fresh and refreshed perspectives. The third general step in reviewing your translation is, instead of floating through this review stage, you will want to dig deep into each issue that you noted during the draft stage, or that you notice now. Clear all the brambles of possible objections, challenges, counter-arguments for your completed translation, especially if the text you're translating is more intellectual or academic rather than poetic or melodic, such as a treatise instead of a sutra with lots of verses. At this stage, too, I make any specific issues of note. I highlight it. I specifically add a comment. I make it very apparent, so that way when I come back to it again, I know that I will be able to find that issue. The fourth step in the review stage is references and notes. You need to cite other works as appropriate. Sometimes footnotes and endnotes can help. They explain certain minor points, but may interrupt the flow of a translation. So add them if you find they are essential. To review the English against the Chinese, a lot of times I need to scroll back to the Chinese to see what the original said again. Oftentimes I copy and paste an entire paragraph, nearly an entire paragraph, closer to the English. Oftentimes English is much longer than the Chinese. That way I could see almost a line-by-line view of the two languages. I make sure that they are parallel. Sometimes in making corrections, I actually end up with more errors I have to correct later. That's because oftentimes I'm eager to insert the correction, and as a result, some of the context or the rest of the sentence around it have not been adjusted accordingly. In terms of accurate terminology, it requires some research before you actually begin to amend your draft translation at the review stage. I had done some search, and the first term that we come to in the prose section of this sutra is Rajagriha, Wang Shechen. That's the first term that I wanted to look up to make sure that it's correct, and it is indeed Rajagriha. The second one is also a Sanskrit term, and this one is Grijakuta. I actually prefer to use terms that are always more understandable to the reader upon first reading. This is actually Vulture Peak, so I would choose Vulture Peak instead of the Sanskrit term. Similarly, you will see some of the other terms throughout this text where I try to use plain English language that's understandable to a person in general who may be reading a Buddhist text for the first time. Some of the flowers, like Zhanbohua, that's gardenia. 婆氏家花 is a summer flower and a rain flower, but it's not clear what exact name of the flower is in English. In Sanskrit, it's Varsika or Vasikala. So I just combined two of the English flower terms and made it into one. There's an actual and very specific plant term for Atimudo Jiahua, and that's Atimutata. And you can tell just by the pronunciation that it's a Sanskrit transliteration. When it comes to the section on the Tianlong Babu, the gods and dragons of the 8 types, such as Yakshas, Gandharvas, some of those, where I can, I tried to put them in generally understandable terms, like Maharaga is a giant python. Adding birds to Garuda. Garuda is known to be the golden-winged birds. Keeping the name Garuda, but adding birds to it, Garuda birds. I may do that with yakshas. Yakshas are a type of ghost, so maybe yaksha ghosts. With arhats, it's another debatable one where I either would just use arhats or arhat sages. Gandharvas, I don't know of a English equivalent. Titans or demigods are terms that have been used for asuras, so I use titans here. That's kind of at the terminology level, some of the different debates that go on in my head as I make a determination on which terms to use. Just a note about some differences between the Chinese and English. Chinese tends to be in a passive voice, whereas English really should more often be in an active voice. In reviewing, editing, and proofreading your translation from Chinese to English, you oftentimes need to find the subject and object of a sentence. Sometimes it's not easy to find the subject of a sentence in Chinese. That's one of the differences. Another difference is that sometimes the Chinese doesn't specify whether something is singular or plural. With the Avatamsaka Sutras, this particular category, I tend to use plurals in general just because the Avatamsaka Sutras are so inclusive. Using the plural nouns also tend to be more inclusive. So, for example, they versus he or she. They in plural form is much more inclusive than the singular he or she. Enlightening beings are used rather than an enlightening being, just because Avatamsaka Sutras tend to talk about an infinite number of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, enlightening beings and Buddhas, rather than just one Buddha, usually Shakyamuni Buddha. More often than not, the translator from Chinese to English needs to add details, elaborate on the Chinese to make the English more clear. For instance, where the Chinese specify a masculine form or a feminine form, of course, I as a translator would accord. But if gender isn't specified, then I, as a female translator, tend to want to be more inclusive and include a gender-neutral term so that it applies to everyone. Although I keep in the back of my head, too, that a lot of times these sutras were spoken by and created for and spoken to men, they do have a more masculine-dominated voice. Tense is sometimes missing from the Chinese or not obvious, so an English translator would add in whether it's past, present, and future, making that consistent throughout. Whether this is in a past form where the Buddha said this, the disciple asked that, or in a present tense form where the Buddha tells this and the enlightening being says that. I prefer the present form, so whenever I can, I would use the present tense, as you can see from some of the examples to have them. This is not the stage where you're trying to do everything in one breath, but that it's a repeated improving of a piece. I usually listen to the sounds that are occurring to me as I review and edit. You may be more auditory or you may be more visual. You should know that for yourself, and you should probably also know already some of your weaknesses and strengths in your writing and where you tend to err or lapse if you're not more vigilant. I tend to need to be especially vigilant about third person tense. With the Chinese language in my head, sometimes I tend to miss the S at the end of a verb for a third person. And article, that's another one for me. Using the or not using the. With the word program, the spelling is always great when it highlights it for you, when you can correct the spelling errors right there. Some of the word grammar notes may be applicable and sometimes not, especially when it comes to certain Buddhist terms. Word just doesn't recognize it. So you may want to be aware of that yourself. I also always need to check again the consistency in lists, whether the list is in all nouns or all verbs. Verbs are always more powerful, of course, but I always try to make sure that when in a list, everything is consistent. So you see me coming back to these lists of tens and always making sure that they're all nouns or they're all verbs. Usually they're all nouns. I also like to do the synonym search sometimes. Instead of using the same word as if there's only one definition to a word or one facet to a meaning, I like to use different synonyms that represent the multiple aspects of a Chinese character or Chinese phrase. You notice here how I sometimes even write synonym right in there because I need to look up a synonym. And you also notice how, for example, with diligence, I would use effort in some places, vigilance, and vigor. All those are used because they really are the different facets to a gem. They shed different light to the meaning that you're trying to convey. It's rare to hear a translator, especially a translator of Buddhist texts, discussing his or her common errors and tendencies and struggles. But hopefully those are actually things shared that will make you become more aware of your own strengths and weaknesses. That way you can better utilize them or improve on them. I don't believe that appearing high and mighty or perfect is the way to helping others understand Buddhism or the Buddhist teachings. So I hope what I'm sharing helps you, even though not too many Buddhist translators talk about these issues and more specifically being vulnerable.